On this episode of Forever Spinning, we'll go back to 1984 to study one of Black Flag's most influential records, My War.
Perfect.
Following the release of their 1981 debut album, Damaged, Black Flag were one of the most prestigious hardcore bands around. However, the release of Damaged would not go over well for some people. Black Flag had signed to Unicorn Records, a subsidiary of MCA, and were supposed to release Damaged on that label. The executives at the label banned the record from being released, citing that it was too violent and too vulgar. Undeterred by Unicorn's demands, Greg Ginn, the unanimous leader of Black Flag, decided to put the album out on his own label, SST. As you probably guessed, this didn't go well for Black Flag. Soon after the album hit the shelves, Unicorn caught wind of the ruse that Ginn and the boys had pulled, and consequently sued Black Flag and SST. The band was no longer allowed to release music under the name Black Flag and were stuck in legal limbo for roughly 2 years. During this time period, the group had wised up and decided to release a double LP titled Everything Went Black. This record is compiled of various early recordings of their singles, many of which feature different singers that had led the band in previous times. To bypass the ridiculous restrictions put on them, the album did not have the band's name on it, instead opting to credit each individual member who is present on each track. Since Everything Went Black was a compilation album and did not require new writing, the band had a lot of time on their hands during their 2 years forced hiatus. Sure, they toured a lot during this time, gaining more and more notoriety as SoCal's most sought after group to see live, but they also wrote a lot of music during this time, almost 3 full albums to be exact. One of which is the topic of this video today, My War. At this point in the band's history, they had cycled through plenty of members. By the time recording for My War was getting ready to begin, the group had been whittled down to Henry Rollins on vocals, Bill Stevenson on drums, and Greg Ginn on guitar. Ginn wasn't satisfied with just playing guitar, however, as he decided to pick up bass for My War. He eventually would be credited as his pseudonym Dale Nixon for his bass contributions. The contents of My War would be a completely different beast in comparison to their debut and early singles. Sure, they were still a hardcore band, but Ginn had begun experimenting with his instruments to find effective ways to fundamentally sound different. No longer were they playing loud and fast. Instead, they were playing loud and methodical. The only true constant on My War is the vocal stylings of Henry Rollins. His vocals were aggressive as ever, and the lyrics were torturous and self-loathing. And the instrumentals backed this up, ranging from oral outlashes on songs like My War to slow, treacherous marches on songs like Nothing Left Inside. The record can be split rather distinctly from the A-side to the B-side. The A-side being more focused on their older hardcore style, just with longer run times and more complex progressions. The B-side, however, can be described as some of the earliest versions of sludge metal. After its recording, Black Flag were officially allowed to release My War after Unicorn went bankrupt, forcing the label to give all of the rights back to Ginn and SST. So, finally, in March of 1984, My War was released on SST Records to eager ears, but resulted in mixed receptions. There are no singles for My War, so I decided to pick out 3 songs that I think deserve some attention, starting with the album's opening song and title track, My War. My War is one of the more cut-and-dry hardcore tracks to come off this album. Chuck Dukowski, the co-founder and former bassist of Black Flag, had written the song prior to his departure in 1983. He penned this song right before recording sessions for My War began, but the band still decided to use his lyrics anyway. The lyrics themselves were written about the qualms that Dukowski had with Ginn, causing him to leave the group. Dukowski wrote, "My War, you're one of them. You say that you're my friend, but you're one of them." Basically, Dukowski felt that he was fighting a war on his own, and felt that his bandmates were backstabbing him, leaving him to feel alone and unable to trust anyone. This sentiment is carried out through the entirety of the track, as Rollins' vocals add an added sense of anxiety and fear. And if you ask me, this is probably the greatest Black Flag track ever written. The next track that I would like to talk about is actually the next song on the album, Can't Decide. Much of the magic from My War comes from the sequencing of the songs, as each is meticulously placed to complement or contrast the next. In this case, Can't Decide follows up My War. While My War is a tirade against the fake friends that have never had our back, Can't Decide sees the band shows defeat instead of anger. Originally penned by Ginn but sung by Rollins, the hook laments, "I conceal my feelings so I don't have to explain what I can't explain anyway." The disparity between the take no prisoners attitude of My War and the gloomy, down on your luck mood of Can't Decide shows how much Black Flag had matured. No longer were they making songs about TV parties or 6-packs of beer, but instead were expressing their feelings feelings through their relentless music. Can't Decide is one of the greatest examples of this on My War, as it expresses the insecurities that Gin had felt during the long downtime that Black Flag had experienced. The last song that I want to touch on from this legendary album is Nothing Left Inside. Nothing Left Inside kicks off side B of My War, as Black Flag hang up their hardcore stylings and replace it with an early sludge metal sound. While Black Flag was in legal hell, they grew out their hair and began playing metal, spawning songs like Nothing Left Inside. Upon returning to the stage with their new material, many fans were taken aback by this change of pace. The stark change of music off of Damage to My War is most apparent with Nothing Left Inside, as it is slow and grueling in comparison to the lightning speeds of Damaged. Not all of their fans abandoned them, however, as Mark Arm, the vocalist of Mudhoney, recalls being brought to tears the first time that he saw Nothing Left Inside live. In many ways, it can be argued that Nothing Left Inside is the most influential song off of My War, despite its polarizing fan reception. I'll be blunt to start this off. I believe My War is one of the most important releases of the 1980s and is certainly Black Flag's best album. I'll be the first one to tell you how much I love Slip It In, Family Man, Damage, The Process of Weeding Out, and even their earliest singles. But if I had to choose one album to represent Black Flag's legacy and career, it would be My War 10 out of 10 times. Besides the fact that it sounds great, it is undeniably influential. Groups like Mudhoney, Melvins, and Nirvana all praise this record for helping them to think outside of the sound that they'd grown so used to. My War helped to pioneer hardcore in a new, different direction. I mean, that is such an intimidating thought. The group had already been out of the game for almost 3 years because of legal issues. Sure, they played shows and all, but it was mostly material that had been previously released on Damaged. Then all of a sudden, they go out on the My War tour and play these drawn-out emotional dirges that focus more on pulling you apart than tearing you to shreds. And so many of their fans hated it. But Black Flag prevailed, playing the challenging material that they wanted to play. Yes, artists make this change all of the time, but how many of them can you say have successfully pulled it off? That number is very few, and that number shrinks even more when you look at how important and influential My War turned out to be. This was also a necessary change of pace in order for the band to survive. While I do love so many early 80s SoCal hardcore groups, they all kind of blur together after some time. Not because I was listening to them too much, but the bands would begin to age and they wouldn't really change their sound, becoming stale and boring. I can honestly say that Black Flag would have never had the legacy that they have today without the change of pace on My War. They would have been like any other SoCal hardcore group, with one singular identity and no room to innovate. So I repeat myself in saying that My War is one of the most important releases of the 1980s. It's not easy tearing yourself down, especially when it involves looking deep inside of your soul and pulling out raw emotions. But if My War proves anything, it's that in order to make progress, we must first tear down everything to its roots before we start again. So whether you've never heard this album before, or if it is one of your personal favorites, Black Flag's My War will always be forever spinning. Thanks for watching.